I used to work the night shift at a gas station in rural Pennsylvania. Not much happened there. It was the kind of place where the biggest excitement of the night was watching a moth throw itself against the buzzing fluorescent lights. I had my routine: refill the coffee pot, wipe down the counter, and stare at the clock, waiting for dawn. But one night, around 2 a.m., something happened. Something I still can't explain. A man walked in. There was something off about him from the moment he stepped through the door. He was tall, too tall, like his bones had been stretched just a little past their breaking point. His skin was pale, almost gray, and he wore a dusty black suit, the kind you'd expect to see on a corpse in an open casket. His shoes were scuffed, his tie slightly loosened, like he had just come from a funeral where no one cried. He didn't make eye contact. He just stood by the coffee machine, motionless. I cleared my throat. "Can I help you?" He turned his head, slow, creaking like a rusted hinge. His lips barely moved as he whispered, "I know your name." A cold, worm-like sensation crawled up my spine. "No, you don't," I said, forcing a chuckle. The man smiled, a tight, unnatural stretch of his lips. "Your mother's name is Linda. Your first pet was a beagle named Rusty. You had a nightmare last night about drowning in a lake." I dropped the coffee pot. It hit the linoleum floor and shattered, the steaming liquid spreading across the tiles. My mouth was dry. How do you know that?" He didn't answer. He just turned and walked out. I rushed to the door, expecting to see him get into a car, hear the crunch of footsteps in the snow, something. But there was nothing. The parking lot was empty. No cars. No footprints. Nothing. I swallowed hard and turned back to the store. The security monitor flickered behind the counter. My hands were still shaking as I rewound the footage. I watched myself on the screen, standing behind the counter. And then, the coffee pot slipped from my hands and shattered on the floor. But there was no man. Just me, talking to no one. I didn't sleep that morning. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, my bedroom door locked, my body still trembling from whatever had happened. By the time my next shift rolled around, I thought about calling in sick. But I needed the money. Gas station pay wasn't great, but it kept my lights on. So I went back, and for a while everything seemed normal. The store smelled like cheap coffee and floor cleaner. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerators and the occasional gust of wind outside. But just past 2 a.m., the coffee machine turned on by itself. I spun around. The machine was filling a cup that wasn't there. I felt something behind me, the cold, creeping sensation of being watched. Then a whisper brushed against my ear. "I know your name." I whirled around, but the store was empty. I stood there frozen, my breath coming in short gasps. And then I did something stupid. I whispered back, "What do you want?" Silence. Then, the lights flickered. The shelves rattled. And I heard something that made my stomach lurch. A sound like laughter. It wasn't coming from the speakers. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the building itself was laughing at me. I bolted, ran out of the store, past the pumps, into the freezing night air. I stood in the empty lot, panting, my breath curling in white clouds. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. Watching. Waiting. The next night, I brought a baseball bat. It made me feel safer, even though I knew deep down that a bat wouldn't do shit against whatever was happening. I kept my back to the counter, watching the front doors. I jumped at every creak, every flicker of the lights. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the automatic doors slid open. There was no wind. No one there. And yet I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Moving toward the counter. The whispering man wasn't visible this time, but I felt him. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest like I was being buried alive. Then the cash register popped open by itself. The receipt paper began printing, filling the roll with words I didn't want to read. I forced myself to look. There on the paper, in neat typed letters. "Come outside." I clenched the bat so hard my knuckles turned white. "No," I whispered. The receipt roll kept printing. "Come outside. Come outside. Come outside." The bat slipped from my fingers. My breathing was ragged, uneven. The door chimed. Something stepped inside. I felt it standing in front of me, close enough to touch, though I saw nothing but empty space. A whisper curled through the air. "I know your name." This time, it wasn't a statement. It was a warning. I quit the next morning. Didn't even bother collecting my last paycheck. I packed a bag, got in my car, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached Ohio. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mom, not my friends. I didn't want them to think I was crazy. But sometimes late at night, I wake up gasping, drenched in sweat. Because sometimes I hear it again. That whisper. Soft. Close. I know your name. And I know wherever I go, he's still watching. Mumbai had a smell. It wasn't bad, not really, but it was distinct. A mix of diesel fumes, damp pavement, frying onions from the street vendors, and the sharp tang of sweat. Some people hated it, said it made them feel like the whole city was pressing down on them. But I liked it. It made me feel like I was somewhere alive. I had been in the city for 3 days when I moved into the apartment. It was small, 1 bedroom, a narrow living room, a kitchen the size of a broom closet. But it was cheap, and the landlord didn't ask many questions. The building was old, with thick walls and ceilings that leaked when it rained. The paint on the doorways was cracked, peeling in long yellow strips, and the staircase smelled like damp wood. The landlord handed me the keys, scratching his belly with thick fingers. He looked at me with something almost like pity. No loud music, no parties, and don't mess with the walls. I had laughed. Why would I mess with the walls? He didn't answer. Just turned and walked away, whistling under his breath. The first night was quiet. Mumbai never really sleeps. There's always a distant horn honking, a dog barking, a train rattling over the tracks, but inside the apartment, it was still. I set up my mattress on the floor, scrolled through my phone until my eyelids got heavy, and fell asleep. Then, at some point past midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The room was dark, the air thick with humidity. I turned onto my side, adjusting my pillow, and that's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound. It was coming from inside the wall. I held my breath and listened. Maybe a rat. Maybe just the building settling. I closed my eyes again. Then, a whisper. Soft, like the sound of dry leaves rubbing together. Right against my ear. Amit. I sat up so fast my head spun. My heart was hammering in my chest. The room was empty, just my suitcases and the bare walls. I swallowed hard, shaking my head. Maybe I had been dreaming. That had to be it. Just a weird, half-asleep hallucination. I turned on some music, lay back down, and convinced myself it was nothing. The next morning, I was exhausted. I chugged 2 cups of cutting chai on the way to work, but the feeling of unease never left. Something about that whisper. It had felt real. At the office, my colleague Rohan noticed the dark circles under my eyes. Dude, you look like you spent the night fighting demons. I forced a laugh. Not demons. Just bad sleep. Rohan smirked. First week in Mumbai will do that to you. I almost told him. Almost asked if he had ever heard of anything weird happening in the old buildings around here. But I didn't. Because what would I even say? I heard a whisper in my walls. And it knew my name. That night, I lay in bed with the lights on. At 2:30 a.m., the whispering started again. This time it was louder. Amit. Amit, come closer. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child. I didn't sleep. Not until the sun rose and the city outside my window started waking up. I should have left. I should have packed my bags right then and there and never looked back. But I didn't. I stayed. 3 days passed. The whispering never stopped. Some nights, it was just a faint rustling inside the walls, like fingertips dragging along the plaster. Other nights, it was worse. The voice grew clearer, more insistent. Amit, let me out. I started sleeping with the TV on, hoping the noise would drown it out. But it didn't. The whispering cut through everything. It didn't matter if I played music, turned up the volume, plugged my ears. The voice found me. I moved my mattress to the living room, thinking maybe if I slept away from the bedroom wall, it would stop. It didn't. One night, around 3 a.m., I snapped. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. My hands were shaking as I walked toward the wall. I placed my palm flat against the plaster. It was warm. Something moved behind it. I jerked my hand back, a choked sound rising in my throat. The whispering stopped, but only for a moment. Then, tap, tap, like knuckles knocking from the inside. I ran out of the apartment and spent the rest of the night in a 24-hour cafe, sipping bitter coffee and trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. I was going to break the wall. I bought a hammer from a hardware shop the next day. The shopkeeper gave me a strange look as he bagged it, but I ignored him. That night I waited. As soon as I heard the first whisper, I swung the hammer. The first hit cracked the plaster. The second sent chunks of drywall crumbling to the floor. The whispering stopped. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I had scared it away. Maybe. Something moved inside the wall. A soft, wet sound. And then, a hand shot out of the hole. It was thin, too long, the skin gray and sagging like wet paper. The fingernails were blackened, curling inward like claws. I stumbled backward, choking on my own breath. The hole in the wall widened. Something was pushing through. A face, half rotted, skin peeling, lips shriveled away, exposing yellow teeth. Empty black sockets where I should have been. It opened its mouth, and the whisper became a scream. I ran. Didn't grab my phone. Didn't grab my shoes. Just ran barefoot down the stairs into the street, gasping for air. I never went back. A week later, I got a call from the landlord. "Amit, what the hell did you do to the wall?" he demanded. I didn't answer. You tenants are all the same. Move in, make a mess, then leave without notice. Then, softer, almost to himself. The new guy already moved in. My stomach twisted. What? He lasted 3 days. I swallowed hard. What happened? A long pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he heard his name in the walls. I hung up, and I never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm lying in bed in a different city, in a different apartment, I hear it, a faint whisper. Soft. Close. Amit. Amit, come closer. And I know. It followed me. Tokyo can be strange at night. Even in the busiest parts of the city, there are moments when the streets feel too empty, the neon lights too cold, the silence stretching just a little too long between distant car horns. You'll be walking home, thinking about work, about rent, about whether you left the stove on. Then suddenly, you realize you're alone. Completely alone. That's what it was like that night. I had stayed late at the office, working overtime on a project I didn't care about for a boss who didn't care about me. By the time I stepped out of the building, it was nearly midnight. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual nightlife seeming to hold its breath. My route home was always the same. Past the station, down 2 busy roads, then a shortcut through a quiet street lined with vending machines and old, crumbling buildings. A street that, despite its emptiness, always felt like it had eyes. That's where I saw her. A woman in a red dress, standing perfectly still under a flickering street lamp. Her back was to me. I hesitated. There was something off about her stance, the way her hands hung at her sides, limp. She wasn't moving, not shifting her weight, not checking her phone. Just standing, waiting. I swallowed hard and kept walking. As I passed, she moved. Her head snapped around too fast, like a puppet on broken strings. And she smiled. A smile that was too wide, stretching almost ear to ear, her lips curling at the edges like something out of a cartoon. Her teeth were perfectly straight, too white almost like dentures, except they looked sharp. Her eyes were the worst part. Wide, unblinking, watching me. Then she spoke. Hello. Her voice was soft, too soft, like a breath against my skin. I gritted my teeth and kept walking. She followed. Her footsteps were light but deliberate, click, 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 her heels tapping in perfect rhythm with mine. I told myself to ignore it. Maybe she was drunk. Maybe she was just messing with me. Then she spoke again. Louder. Hello. I walked faster. She did too. Click, 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 click. The sound grew faster, but her breathing, I could hear it now, stayed slow, steady. I turned a corner, breaking into a jog. For a moment, the sound of her footsteps vanished. I risked a glance over my shoulder. She was closer. Too close. I ran. And then, silence. No footsteps. No breath. Nothing. I stopped, panting, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned. She was gone. Just the empty street, the distant hum of Tokyo, the neon lights flickering above. I let out a shaky breath and took out my phone. My hands were trembling as I checked the time. 12:17 a.m. Then, my phone buzzed. A text message. No number. Just 2 words. I saw you. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. That impossible smile burned into my brain. At some point, I must have dozed off because I dreamed of her. She was in my room, standing over me, her breath slow even, watching, smiling. Then she leaned closer, until her lips were almost brushing my ear, and whispered, "Hello." I woke up gasping. My phone was on the floor. The screen was shattered. I tried to move on. I really did. For a few days, nothing happened. I told myself it had been a prank, a hallucination, something my exhausted brain had cooked up after too many late nights. Then, exactly 1 week later, my phone buzzed again. A picture message. It was blurry, taken in low light, but I knew exactly what I was looking at. My apartment building. My window. I swallowed hard. Someone had taken this photo. From outside. From the street. I rushed to the window and pulled back the curtain. Nothing. But I felt it. A weight in the air. A wrongness. I shut the curtains and turned off my phone. I decided, then and there, that I was moving. The next day, I broke my lease. Packed my things. That night was my last in that apartment. I tried to sleep, but my body wouldn't let me. Every creak in the walls, every rustle of fabric, sent a fresh spike of panic through me. At some point, exhaustion won. My eyelids drooped. My breathing slowed. Then, click. Not a footstep. A tongue click. Right next to my ear. I froze. A slow, thick breath. My heart felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. I didn't move. Couldn't. Then, as if a string had been cut, my body jerked upright. The room was empty, but the closet door was open, and the mirror across the room. It wasn't empty. I saw her, standing inside the mirror, smiling at me. Her head tilted, her too wide grin stretching impossibly. She lifted her hand and waved. I left the next morning. Didn't even wait for sunrise. Just grabbed my bags and left Tokyo for good. I never told anyone the full story. What could I even say? I saw a woman in a red dress. And now she sees me. Even now, years later, in a different city, in a different country. Some nights, I wake up too suddenly, my breath coming fast, my skin damp with sweat. And I feel it, like someone was just watching me. And in the dark, just before my eyes fully open, I hear it, a whisper. Too close, too soft. Hello. I was 8 years old when my grandmother died. It was sudden. One day, she was making tamales in the kitchen, her silver hair pinned in a tight bun, her wrinkled hands moving fast and sure, and the next she was gone. A stroke, they said. She didn't suffer. But I wasn't thinking about that at her funeral. I was thinking about something she told me when I was younger. Something that had made me laugh at the time, but now sat heavy in my stomach. If someone knocks 3 times after midnight, never answer. I had asked her why, and she had just shaken her head, eyes dark and serious. They come for the ones who let them in, she said. At 8 years old, I didn't understand what that meant. I would soon. The night after her funeral, I couldn't sleep. The house felt too big, too empty. Even though my mother was in the next room, I felt alone. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to a sound. 3 knocks. Knock. 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 I held my breath. Maybe I had imagined it. Then it came again. Knock. 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 Slow. Heavy. Measured. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake my mother. I tiptoed to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peeked outside. There, under the dim glow of the street lamp, stood an old man in a black hat. He wasn't moving. He wasn't even blinking. His face was too pale, almost gray, and his mouth was set in a tight, straight line. His eyes, God, his eyes, were sunken like 2 black pits in his skull, and yet, I could feel them looking straight through the door. A cold, creeping fear wrapped around me. I turned and ran to my mother's room. I shook her awake, barely able to speak. "There's a man outside," I whispered. She sat up, groggy and confused. "What?" "Someone's knocking." She frowned but followed me to the window. The street was empty. The old man was gone. "You had a nightmare," she said, rubbing my arm. "Go back to sleep." I didn't. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening, waiting. The next night, the knocks came again. Knock, knock, knock. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the blanket over my head. I didn't dare move. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was shining through the curtains. The night before felt far away, like a dream, until I walked past the front door. There, in the dirt outside, were footprints. Not just leading to the door, leading from the door to my window. I told my mother. She tried to act calm, but I saw the way her hands shook when she locked the doors twice that night. A week later, Miguel disappeared. He was 2 years older than me, the boy next door, always teasing me for being scared of ghosts. That night, his mother woke up to a noise. 3 knocks. She thought it was her husband coming home late from work. She fell back asleep. In the morning, Miguel was gone. The police searched everywhere. They found no signs of a break-in. His bedroom window was wide open, but there were no footprints outside. Nothing except the muddy impression of a handprint on the glass. After that, I stopped sleeping at night. I stayed awake, listening, waiting, barely breathing. And the knocks kept coming. Every night. Knock, knock, knock. Never earlier, never later. Always at 3 a.m. I never answered. And slowly the knocks faded. Until one night, they stopped completely. I thought it was over. I was wrong. Years passed. I grew up. Moved away. For a long time, I convinced myself that what happened when I was a child had been some kind of shared delusion. That maybe my mind had filled in the blanks, made up things that weren't there. Then last month, my mother called me. Her voice was quiet. They came back. My stomach twisted. Knock, knock, knock. She heard them the night before. I swallowed hard. Did you look? A pause. Then. No. Good. We talked for a while, but neither of us mentioned Miguel. We didn't have to. We both knew what happened to him. Last night, I heard it again. I was in my apartment, in a completely different city, miles and miles away from my childhood home. It was impossible. But at exactly 3 a.m., knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate. I sat up in bed, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just listened. And then, from the corner of my room, a whisper. Soft, almost kind, but wrong. You never answered. My body went cold. I didn't turn. I didn't run. I just stayed perfectly still, waiting for the sun to rise. And when it did, I found footprints. Not outside. Inside. Leading from my bedroom door to my bed. I don't know what happens when you answer the door. I don't want to know. But one thing is clear. They never stopped knocking. They just got tired of waiting. I've been driving a taxi in Moscow for 15 years. Night shifts mostly. I like the quiet, the hum of the engine, the way the city lights blur in the snow. I've seen all kinds of people. Businessmen too drunk to remember their addresses. Lovers tangled in the back seat, whispering secrets. Tourists holding crumpled maps and looking at me like I might rob them. But there's one passenger I'll never forget. And I hope to God she's the last of her kind I ever meet. It was early December, the kind of night where the cold gets inside your bones and stays there. Snow fell thick and heavy, muting the sounds of the city. Most sane people were already inside, tucked away in their warm apartments. I had just dropped off my last fare and was debating whether to call it a night when I saw her. She stood beneath a flickering street lamp. The first thing I noticed was that she wasn't dressed for the weather. Black coat, yes, but no hat, no scarf, no gloves. Just long, pale fingers hanging limp at her sides. She lifted one hand. Her wave was too slow, like she wasn't in any hurry. Something about it made my stomach tighten. I should have driven away. But a fare is a fare. I pulled over. She opened the door and slid into the back seat without a word. Her presence felt wrong. Not just quiet. Empty. Like she had stepped into my cab out of a dream. I adjusted the mirror and got my first good look at her face. High cheekbones. Hollow eyes. Lips pressed into a thin line. She whispered an address. I frowned. It wasn't in Moscow. It wasn't even near Moscow. It was miles away, deep in the countryside. She shouldn't have been out here alone. Not at this hour. Not in this weather. I hesitated. Then she spoke again, soft as snowfall. Please. Something in that voice made my hands move before my brain could catch up. I put the car in drive. For the first 20 minutes, she didn't say a word. She didn't fidget. Didn't check her phone. She just stared. At me. Not out the window. Not at the road. At me. The longer she sat there, the colder the car felt. I turned up the heat. It didn't help. You live out there? I asked, trying to break the silence. Nothing. I forced a chuckle. Must be nice. Peaceful. She blinked. Once. Then, in a voice inside my head, I heard, "Turn left." I froze. The words hadn't come from her mouth. They had come from inside my skull. I tightened my grip on the wheel. "What did you say?" She didn't respond. Her eyes, dark as wet stones, bore into mine through the mirror. And my hands, they moved on their own. The car turned left. The city disappeared. The streetlights vanished. The road narrowed, twisting through a forest where the trees leaned in too close, their branches like fingers reaching for the car. Snow clung to the windshield, the wipers barely keeping up. The GPS lost signal. And still I drove. She didn't speak again. Didn't move. Didn't blink. I tried to fight the feeling crawling up my spine. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. I licked my lips. You, visit family out here? Silence. I cleared my throat. It's just. Keep driving. The voice inside my head again. Colder. Sharper. A needle of ice pressed against the base of my skull. The road ahead was nothing but darkness and snow. And then, a house. Or what was left of one. It sat in a clearing, roof half-collapsed, windows shattered. The kind of place that had been dead for years. My throat tightened. I pulled to a stop. Here. I managed. She nodded. I gripped the wheel so hard my fingers ached. Are you sure? She reached for the door handle. That's when I saw them. Her hands. Her skin was wrong, grayish, stretched too tight over the bones. And her nails. Splintered. Blackened. Like she'd been clawing at something. She stepped out. But she didn't leave footprints. I turned to watch her walk away. She didn't. She wasn't there. She had never been there. I slammed the car into reverse. The tires skidded. The car refused to move. Panic flooded my veins. I slammed my foot on the gas. The wheels spun uselessly. Something shifted in the mirror. She was sitting in the back seat again. My heart stopped. She smiled. It was too wide. Too many teeth. The world spun. And then, I woke up in my car. Sunlight streamed through the trees. The road was clear. The snow was gone. And the back seat was empty. I sat there, shivering, lungs dragging in air like I had nearly drowned. I was parked in Moscow, right where I had picked her up. I tried to shake it off. Tried to forget. But it never left me. Because the next day, I looked up the address. And there it was. 20 years ago, a woman had killed her husband in that house. Stabbed him in his sleep. The police searched the whole area. Her body was never found. She had vanished. I don't drive at night anymore. But sometimes, when I'm out late, I see a woman standing under a flickering street lamp. Black coat. Long, pale fingers. And when I pass her, she lifts one hand. Slow. Too slow. Waiting for another ride. Waiting for another driver. Waiting for you.